Welcome to module 2 of our Spring Boot course. So in this lesson, we are going to talk about a very fundamental or a basic thing which is being provided by the Spring Boot, and that is the auto configuration. We have talked a little bit about this in our previous lessons, but this specific lesson is going to cover the auto configurations in a much detailed fashion, right? How the auto configuration works, how the Spring Boot is actually configuring the auto configurations, how you can find all those details. So we are going to look into those kind of details. Let's quickly have a look at what we are going to cover in this lesson. So we are going to get a little bit a basic definition about what auto configuration is. We are going to see why do we actually need this auto configuration in Spring Boot application. What kind of benefits or what kind of advantages it's giving us, right? How it is different with rather than like you're working on a Spring Embassy application, and how it is different. And then of course, like as I said, right, the point 2 and point 3 are related. What are the benefits of using Spring Boot in our application, right? Sorry for the typo, it's more towards the auto configuration in our application. And then we are going to look into a little bit more detail into the Spring these auto configuration in action. We are going to see how those things are get into the picture when you start your Spring Boot application, and uh, how the configurations works behind the scene, right? So we will be taking a deeper look into those things. And then we will have a little bit more details about the auto configurations. All right. Okay. So let's see what auto configuration is. It's a typical definition about the auto configuration, but we will have a look around it, right? So Spring Boot auto configuration attempts to automatically configure your Spring application based on the jar dependencies. Uh, this is just a standard definition from the Spring Boot documentation, but it talks about a number of different things, right? So we can have a kind of a detailed discussion about it. So the how the auto configuration work is, you tell Spring that okay, this is what you need, and based upon your configuration, Spring Boots take an approach where it's try to auto configure your application. For example, in this definition, if you have a HSQLDB on your class path, right, what Spring Boot auto configuration is going to do for you is it's all automatically going to create your database connection bean. Also it's also automatically going to create your in-memory database. So in short, you tell Spring that you want to use HSQLDB. Rest of the things are being automatically taken care by the Spring, making sure that all the required beans are registers and created for you. Database connection is in place, in-memory database is in place, and other configuration which are really required, right? So that's the magic of the auto configurations. Okay. Okay, so the next question is about what are the different ways to enable the auto configuration in your Spring Boot application, right? So in order to enable the auto configuration magic in your Spring Boot application, you have two options on a high level. The first option is either you are going to use the enable auto configuration annotation, or the second option is you are going to use the Spring Boot application annotation on your configuration class. Most of the time, until unless you really have a very compelling reason to do it, Spring Boot application annotation is your go-to point. Most of your so it's your main application class, your main class is being it's gonna you are going to annotate that class with the Spring Boot application annotation, and rest of the things will be taken care by this annotation. This annotation is nothing but a combination of the different annotation. One of them is basically make sure that the auto configuration feature is automatically enabled for your Spring Boot application. So that's what the theory is. Let's look into the more details. Let's have a look into the source code or some of the application logic or some of the application details to see how the auto configuration works when you are working onto the Spring Boot application. All right, so let's try to get the answer of a very basic questions, probably if you are starting with your Spring Boot, that's probably one of the question that will come to your mind, right? The question is, why do I need auto configurations, right? We have a brief discussion about it. Okay, and to answer this question, let's take a very simple example. This configuration, I have used this configuration, not this one, the beam configuration, from a very standard Spring MVC application, and this application is not using a Spring Boot. Okay, so in order to handle the view, right, if you already have no experience working with the Spring Boot, Spring applications, I need to configure this internal resource view resolver, which is making sure, okay, what is my view resolver? It's a JSP. What are the prefix? What is the suffix? I also need to have a locale resolver. I If you are handling the messages for your application, you also need to configure the message, how you want to read the messages. uh, you have to configure your dispatcher servlet either in your web.xml file, or if you are using a Java configuration, so you may have to use uh, the Java kind of, you have to configure your dispatcher servlet into the your web into your Java configuration. So in short, what I need is these default configurations, right? I also need dispatcher servlet, right? And other required configurations, right? So this is very standard or a typical kind of a configuration with the Spring Boot, sorry, my bad, with the Spring MVC application. As I said, right, probably if you're using a Hibernate or a JPA, you need other configurations. You have to integrate the Spring with the JPAs. For example, if you're using Hibernate, you have to use the Hibernate configurations and all other stuff, right? Now let's look into the Spring Boot web application, and we will have a closer look what all configurations I need in order to enable the web behavior in my Spring Boot application. So this is a sample Spring Boot application. It's a web application because I have added this web starter dependency, right? If you look into other section of here, I do not have any specific web.xml file. I'm not redefining any dispatcher servlet and other things, right? I'm saying I need a time I leave as a templating engine, but I am not defining any kind of additional configurations or anything as part of while I want to use it, right? This is where the auto configuration comes into the picture. You define these are the things you needed, and then Spring Boot automatically configure couple of things for you, right? You are not defining those things. So that's how the Spring Boot auto configuration works. And just to give you an idea, if you look into this one, right, what I was talking about, this is my main application. In order to enable the auto configuration feature for my Spring Boot application, I have used this Spring Boot application annotation. This is automatically going to make sure that the auto configuration feature is enabled for my Spring Boot application. And if you look into the details of this one, this is nothing but what I was initially talking about, right? Enable auto configuration. Either you can use this individual annotation on the configuration classes, or the better way is to use the Spring Boot application annotation, because not only it gives you the auto configuration feature, but it also gives you certain other features provided by the Spring Boot. So let's see this auto configuration feature into action. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start this application, and then we will have a look into the consoles or on the startup to see what Spring Boot is doing for us by just adding this Spring Boot auto configuration annotation. So it's in a combination of what you are adding into your pom.xml file and once you enable the auto configuration feature. So let's start our application to see this auto configuration in action. Okay, all right. So our application started and there are a couple of things you can see onto the console, right? Uh, we already have talked about this in the previous lessons, but I just want to reiterate a couple of things here. So this is the dispatcher servlet that has been created and mapped for us. We never defined the dispatcher servlet. There are a couple of different filters which are required in order for our web application to work, but we never defined those configuration, right? There is a web application context that has been created by the Spring Boot. It started the Tomcat server. It knows, okay, because it's a web application, I need to deploy it onto the application server, right? So these things are automatically being taken care for you. You never define those things, and if you already are coming out from the Spring MVC or any of the web MVC framework, you will immediately going to realize that you are kind of you're not required to have all those kind of a different configuration based upon certain things, certain configuration, which is as I said multiple times, what you are defining into pom.xml, couple of things are being taken care for you. So these are the auto configuration. You always have a way to override or to control the auto configuration behavior. We will be going to talk about that. So let's now have a let's get into a little bit more detail how those things are being taken care for you by the Spring Boot, right? It's a magic, but there is a certain configuration, right? There must be something which Spring Boot is referring to, or it's basically looking into those details, and then maybe a certain configuration which says, okay, hey, it's a web application, I need those I need to configure those things for this application. So let's have a some let's have a deeper details into those things. Okay, all right. So when you configure your Spring Boot application, there are certain dependencies which are automatically added by the Spring Boot. Okay, and one of that dependency is the Spring Boot auto configuration jar file. This auto configuration have a certain configurations in place. The one which I'm going to give you a more detail is if you get into the meta inf folder, you will have the Spring factories property file, right? Let's open this property file. Give you a better picture. I'm just keep going to scroll it. So let's see how it works. So there are certain naming conventions, those are being used by the Spring Boot, right? If you see this one, right? When you use the Spring Boot, these are the list of the configurations which are automatically being auto configured for you by the Spring Boot. Okay. Uh, and how it works is there are based upon the combination of your pom.xml file what you have configured. Spring Boot basically use these files spring.factory to understand, okay, what are the list of the auto configurations and what are the different classes which will be automatically going to be configured for you. So you don't have to worry about creating the beans, making sure that the beans are initialized and everything else. That will be automatically going to be taken care for you. Okay, so that is always going to be your go-to point, and this is where the magic of auto configuration lies. Okay, we we will have a more details into it, because when we are going to create our custom auto configurator, we are going to create this Spring factory class, and then we'll see how we can enable it. But just to give you a brief idea, this is how the Spring Boot handles the auto configuration logic, and it understand what are the different classes which needs to be auto configured for your application. So if you're interested to find out what is the class which is doing this magic, right? What is the class which is reading this spring.factory property file and making sure that all the configurations are in place for your application. So your friend is auto configuration import selector. This is the class. Most probably you won't get into a situation where you want to touch this class. But this is just for your information purpose, that this is the class which is responsible to read or to in short to scan the spring.factory class and do the rest of the things, right? Reading it, scanning it, and then making sure all the configurations are in place. One more example for a better understanding or a clear understanding, what I'm going to search is the dispatcher servlet auto configuration, right? This is the auto configuration class for the dispatcher servlet. Remember we said that while working on the Spring Boot web application, you are not configuring or you're not defining a dispatcher servlet. This is being automatically taken care for you by the Spring Boot once you enable the auto configuration feature of the Spring Boot. So this is the auto configuration class that has been created by the Spring Boot in order to instantiate or in order to create the dispatcher servlet for you. All you have to do is, if you have a web application configured for your application, Spring Boot will have the dispatcher servlet configuration ready for you. Let's have a look at it, right? So this is our dispatcher servlet. We have talked about this one, but just to give you an idea, this auto configuration class make sure that the dispatcher servlet is ready for you to, like, it's basically there, all the configurations are in place in order to start working on your web application. There are a number of things we will be talking about these in our advanced lessons, how the this magic works, how the auto configuration magic works, how do it determine whether I want to create a dispatcher servlet for the application or not. So if you see, these are some conditional annotations that has been created by the Spring Boot. For example, a conditional on web application. So that means this is one of the condition that this dispatcher servlet auto configuration will come into the picture if our web application type is a servlet. Then there is also a condition based upon a class, that is if there is a dispatcher servlet class into the class path. So we will get into more details, but this was just to give you an idea what is auto configuration, what are the different benefits of the auto configuration. As we talked about those things, you are not basically, there are multiple configuration those has been created for you, right? And how the auto configuration works for you, how do Spring have all the details. So your magic point or the configuration file is the spring.factories, which is under your Spring Boot auto configuration. You can also create your custom configurators. All you have to do is to use the same configurations, right? So I hope that this will give you a better understanding about the Spring Boot auto configuration feature and why do we really want to enable this feature into our Spring Boot application. Okay, in the last, I just want to talk about a last feature. As I said, right, so auto configurations are just a feature. It's a benefit for you, but Spring Boot is not going to force you to use the auto configuration. You have all the way to override gradually replacing your auto configuration files, or you can always disable some auto configuration classes if you really don't need those one, right? For example, you have a a data source auto configuration, right? You don't want to use it. What you have to do is, in your configuration class, if you are using a Spring Boot application or if you are using the enable auto configuration annotation, there is a parameter which says exclude, and it takes a list or the list of the configuration classes, right? So what you can do is, you can always say, for example, data source auto configuration class. You can always pass a comma separated list of all the configuration classes which you want to exclude as part of your auto configuration files. Okay. Uh, when you start creating your own configuration classes, for example, data source, right? There is already a data source being created by the Spring Boot automatically if you are using HSQLDB or let's say any of the JPA implementation. So those will be automatically created for you. But the moment you define your own configuration, Spring Boot transparently going to use your configuration and automatically going to replace the out of the box configuration file for you. So that's the overall beauty of your Spring Boot auto configurations. I hope that will give you a better picture about the auto configurations and how it works.